All right, so now that we are live, anybody have an objection to me recording? None? Okay. Let's go ahead and do this. So curious, anybody have any concerns about legal and ethical, or not ethical, but more legal issues with nursing? Anybody feel really confident in the legality of nursing? Yeah, I feel like most students kind of fall in between there. They're like, I'm not really super worried about it, but I don't really know what I'm looking at either. So we're not going to go super in depth on it, just kind of more of an overview and really talking about how you guys to keep safe, how to keep your licenses safe, and really and how to protect patients too. So that's kind of our objectives today. So let me make sure I'm in here. Oh, perfect. So let's talk about this little case study first. The LPN is assigned to 30 residents in a long-term care facility. She is administering medications and supposed to administer heart medicine. The apical pulse must be taken before the medication is given. The nurse feels she just doesn't have time to stop and take the pulse. When she charts, she looks at the record of the previous pulse count and kind of like gets an average of where it's been. She documents this pulse with the medication. What's your first take on that situation? 30. I see some shaking heads. I think we've probably all seen that done, like I know I've worked with people who have been like, their blood pressure looks like 117 on 24, or, one, well, probably not 24, right? But kind of just like looking at it, not really checking what it might be. So what is this an example of? The chapter in your book gave you several terms. What is this an example of though? And put back in. You guys are right. It is unethical behavior. We're going to talk about these terms a little bit more and what it means. Like, what is ethical versus unethical? What is correct abuse? All those things. So, your personal values, those have a big part of what you believe are like your personal ethics. So ethics is actually a branch of philosophy, right? So you can actually go, I don't think here at Bates, but at other colleges, there's whole courses designed to look at ethics and what that means as a culture and beliefs. So it's your values and ethics that are intertwined to determine like what your behavior is. And so different societies and cultures are going to have different ethics. So what even like different parts of this country in the States, depending on where you are, there might be a little bit of different ethical values, even though we might say, yeah, we're all citizens here of the States. We all kind of have the same general upbringing. We still might have a little bit of ethical values. So ethical dilemmas are situations that result in a blank of two or more fundamental values. What does that mean? Conflict, a blending, a change, or a discussion. Okay. And good job. It's a conflict, right? The dilemmas is when you have some values that you hold dear. So you know this needs to be done, but there's also this. In the situation that we talked about earlier, where we had the nurse who was very busy, she had 30 patients, but this heart rate also required her to take this extra time. What was the conflict there? Time for other patients. Yeah. So it's giving the medicine, taking the time for this one patient, but also knowing that she needed that time for all of the rest of the patients. And so it's not that one choice is always clearly wrong. When you're having an ethical dilemma, it's because there's two things that you're holding, that you're like, hey, I value checking the heart rate before I give this medication. But I also value safety for the rest of my patients. And I know I actually, guys, like nurse, anybody had dreams about work or nursing? I had a dream, and it's been a recurring dream since I started as a baby nurse. I started in a really, really busy med surg unit in a hospital. And this is when I was an RN and I was very busy. I had up to 13 patients at night. And I would have a CNA that was split between me and another nurse. The CNA would have usually like 20 to 26 patients. So that just seems wild, right? I still have dreams. Like last night, I had a dream that I had a patient who was very sick, and I was there helping this patient, and I was taking care of them. And I looked at the clock, and it was already 11, and I had started my shift at 7 p.m., and I hadn't even seen any of my other patients. And I remember going, oh man, I hope they're okay. But like it's still like that there's a conflict we have, and it's not that in my dream, even it wasn't that that one patient didn't deserve all that care. They were sick. It's that those other patients needed to deserve the care. Anybody else have dreams like that? Something similar? I know, isn't it crazy how our brains just process things sometimes? I'm like, that was 20 some years ago, and still it's still coming back for me. All right, so personal values, they're the underlying principles of ethical behavior. We know that not everybody has the same personal values, though, right? Like even if we talk peer to peer and peer, we're going to have values things that are important to us that we hold dear that are a little bit different from everybody else. The ethical dilemma is what we talk about is especially when it's those more fundamental values, right? If it's more about like, I value driving the speed limit, and somebody's going 5 over, that might give me a little bit of a conflict if I'm riding with somebody else. Whereas if somebody else is like maybe driving impaired and they're not following some of these like societal rules, that might cause a more dilemma within myself because it's not only driving a little bit fast, it's going even further. So it's more of those bigger values that kind of cause more conflict. So we have to develop a framework for ethical decision making. You guys have already started looking into this with our conflict discussion board, and we kind of look at how to handle conflict and or ethical, excuse me, our ethical decisions discussion board. So one thing you guys know, as nurses, you're going to face ethical dilemmas every day, even if it's simply the time situation, right? Like that's something that all new grads are probably going to face because you guys are going to be developing, your workflow. Honestly, my little mouse to let this person in. Oh, there it is. Even your time management. Time management is a skill. So when you guys start working, your first job when you graduate very soon, your time management and how you manage your patients is probably not going to be the best. Because remember when you guys were putting in Foley catheter, remember sterile loving, right? Sterile loving was hard. You're like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to do all these steps right and not contaminate, right? But you got it. You figured out how to do it. And I bet now maybe giving you a little practice, you'd be like, okay, I got this. Time management is a skill. So you're going to get better at doing it, but you're going to face these dilemmas every day. Intuition is something that I don't want you guys to, it's not a way to make an ethical decision, but I want you guys to encourage you to listen to your intuition. If something in your gut is saying, this is not right, I really want to encourage you guys to follow that. Follow that until you feel like, okay, that makes sense. Somebody's explained it to you so you understand, or until somebody with a higher authority, maybe your manager, your shift, your charge shift, whatever that is, they are able to say, no, I hear you, but this is, this is what we need to do because of XYZ, right? So maybe you don't feel great about it, but you have somebody, that chain of authority that they're saying, no, this, they're giving you that assurance that it's correct. And the big crux of that is that, guys, it's okay to be nervous, right? Don't be nervous alone. There's going to be a lot. In fact, I hope you're nervous. You should be nervous when you're working, especially your first year when you're learning things. That's you because you don't know everything. Don't be nervous alone, right? If something is like, is this for like this patient is just they look kind of funny to me, right? You're a little bit nervous. Go get that, nurse who's been around for a while. Go get the CNA who's worked with that patient for a long time that knows them really well. Ask for help. Don't be nervous alone. Okay. So what is another term for ethical behavior? So when we look at ethical behavior, is it mandatory, lawful, appropriate, or ideal? Ooh, I love it when we have like a mixed bag. Good job, guys. We can have some talking points. So it's ideal. Good job for whoever chose ideal. So ideal is kind of like what we hope everything would be, right? If we had a perfect society, everybody would operate in an ethical manner. It would be ideal. It's not necessarily mandatory or lawful, and appropriate kind of depends on like it's situational a little bit. So it's an ideal behavior. So in just like kind of little subgroups, I want you guys to look at these terms and match them. So I took these terms here of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, fidelity, and veracity. We use those in the law a lot. I think they're confusing. And then the terms of what it means are over here on the right, but I mixed them up. So take a minute and, with your partners or together, what do you think these terms mean? So we'll go through, I'll pause for a minute while you guys look over these. I have to write things down too. Yeah. Oh. We'll do just another minute and then we'll go over what these actually mean. Yeah. Let's go ahead and let's check what we think we have against what what we have here. So autonomy, that's the right to choose your own actions. I kind of remember this one by Otto, like, right? Otto is like self. And so I can choose what I do for myself, autonomy. Beneficence is do what's good for the patient, right? When we talk about like when you are choosing, um, maybe beneficence, it's like you're encouraging that patient to get up, move around because it is good for them. Non-maleficence is do no harm to the patients. That one I think about, like maleficence sounds like malice or like bad, like you have bad intent. And so non-malice or non-maleficence would be like not doing harm to the patient, right? We are not going to give them a wrong medication or ignore them in their room and let them develop a pressure sore or something like that. Justice, being just, that's part of the definition, but being just and fair, impartial. Fidelity is being faithful to promises or agreements. Where do you think that might come into nursing? Yeah.
If a patient has something like, let's see, and you can, like, they say, I don't know, like medication break, and then you tell the patient, I'll be like that. Don't have to think for me.
Yeah, you do, helping to develop that relationship with the patient so that they will trust you. And then I think it gets even larger with if you are given an assignment, right? Of like, this is there's people and you're like, no, I don't want to care for that person. But if you have accepted that assignment, there's a bit of fidelity that comes into play that you need to do what you were, like you said you would do. And so, right, because that's, you guys know the term, if you choose not to take care of a patient or you don't have somebody else that can take care of them. Abandonment. Yeah, patient abandonment. And then veracity is being truthful and honest with things. So let's get into it a little bit more. We're going to talk just tiny briefly about some other some ethical issues that we might see coming up. Genetics, right? There's a lot of like looking into genetics, and there's some positive things. Like last term, when we talked about people that have it was one of those neuromuscular ones, and it doesn't start until the midlife, and they look like they're drunk. Why am I blanking on this? Huntington's. There we go. Huntington's disease, right? Huntington's doesn't show up until midlife. And so a lot of times that's when people are wanting to have children. And so a lot of times they're looking, do I want to, get my children tested? Do I want to maybe see, I could see where there'd be conversations about in vitro testing if they have Huntington's. Do I want to keep this pregnancy? There's a lot of things that go into that might have some ethical dilemmas. Stem cell research, bioethics is actually a field, like a subdivision of ethics that's come out of this because we have so much technology and knowledge that we know about things, but sometimes we know so much, we forget about maybe the implications that things have. And so there's a whole division of ethics that just kind of talks about this, like ethics in biology and in healthcare. So there's a couple ethical theories that I want us just to be a little bit familiar with. So the theory that you kind of ascribe to or that you follow depends on your values. So deontology, and guys, I don't know if I'm saying these words super correctly because I don't hear them spoken all the time. So if you know how they're said and I'm not saying it right, please let me know. Deontology, it represents your right to fulfill it's your duty to others to fulfill obligations. So you don't want to do harm. It's based on rules and like societal norms, kind of looking at everybody, like your duty to everybody else. And then we have utilitarianism, and that's about looking at a situation based on how will that decision affect everybody else. It's kind of an idea of like, what's good for everybody, not necessarily what's good for the individuals. Utilitarianism that we just talked about often leaves out what group of people. So we're thinking, what is good for most people? Who gets left out of that? Yeah, and it's the minority, right? Because when we're looking at what's good for the greater whole of people, those that are in the minority often will be ignored because it's not about smaller groups of people, it's about the whole. So that's utilitarianism. ethical reasoning. You guys, we've already gone through this with our discussion board, so I'm not going to go through it a lot, but just make sure, when you have this dilemma, think about a situation maybe you might have when you're working, you're not going to realize it's an ethical dilemma right away, right? First of all, you're going to encounter a situation and you're going to go, this doesn't feel good. I feel really uncomfortable, and maybe you'll be able to go, okay, hold on, this is an ethical dilemma. But I want you guys, and whenever like you have something that happens, you're like, oh, this doesn't feel good, something is wrong. I want you to try to think like, what is it that's bothering me, right? Don't be nervous alone. Go get help. Go get somebody to kind of maybe talk it through with you. Because if there's an ethical dilemma, you want to be able to have a plan, right? You want to know what's going to happen. And sometimes, especially as a new nurse, you might not know all the policies, procedures, things that are going to protect you and guide you. So get help as well. So legal issues. So you guys are going to be providing care based on established standards. You guys we've talked about the Nurse Practice Act, right? And we have a specific Nurse Practice Act in the state of Washington. If you guys decide to get your multi-state license and you go practice in Oregon or one of our other compact states, know that there's going to be a different Nurse Practice Act in that state you need to be familiar with. I'll tell you, in the states, Nurse Practice Acts are pretty they're pretty similar, right? There's not a lot of huge differences that I'm aware of, but you need to be able to know where to find that practice act and just to be able to know what it says. Excuse me. So the Nurse Practice Act is what sets kind of the legal requirements. It's very generic. It doesn't go into specifics of you can't give Carvedilol at this to this to this. It's very general. But it does establish your rules for licensing. So you guys, like the process of getting your license, how to renew it, all those things, that's very much set by the Nurse Practice Act in this state. It develops and then enforces the rules and regulations. The rules that we have supplement the laws, and we'll go into that a little bit because the rules that are set by our Nurse Practice Act, they're different than the law, right? That's not like there's not a nurse like officer from the Washington State Department of Health that's going to come arrest you for something, but you might get in trouble for not doing something from the state, and you might get in trouble legally with the law as well. Okay, so the State Board of Nursing, like I talked about, they're responsible for licensure and education. They can only enforce rules that are in the Nurse Practice Act. So it's important to know, like if there's, if there's an issue that's outside the Nurse Practice Act, the Washington State Board of Nursing is not going to come after you for something outside of the Nurse Practice Act. They do have disciplinary action though, because if somebody is, doing something against the Nurse Practice Act, they might say, hey, we feel like that was really unsafe, and they can revoke your license, right? Or they might say, hey, you have a substance abuse issue, right? We might suspend your license at this time to practice nursing, and we want you to go seek some substance abuse treatment. We're going to require that of you before you can continue practicing nursing. So the state can actually enforce those things because it's related to your work as a nurse. Bum, bum, bum. So the Nurse Practice Act, what kind of law is it? We haven't really talked about the different kinds of law yet. All right, statutory law. They are statutory laws. So we'll get into institutional practices in a little bit because really institutional practices, anybody would have an idea of what those might be? Yeah, like the local area that you're working, a hospital, a care facility, a clinic, they're going to have institutional laws. Those are going to be your policies and procedures at the clinic or wherever you're at. They're informed from the Nurse Practice Act. That's how we kind of get what we can do. But statutory is what we call like the Nurse Practice Act, and that type of law is statutory law. Sorry, my nose is so itchy today. All right, so statutory law, they are passed from formal law-making bodies like legislator, and then those are enacted laws, and then there's regulatory laws that are made by regulatory agencies like the State Board of Nursing. So common law is more something of like based on common things that happen. Like most people have heard of like common law marriage. Anybody heard of that? Right? You live together with somebody. I think in the state of Washington, is it 7 years? I'm not sure. I know in Kansas, I knew it then, but not because I knew, I just knew. Anyway, you live with somebody for 7 years. Maybe there's things that happen and like you're not actually technically married, you never made it legal, but you can be official, they can call it a common law marriage because you have lived together, shared finances, shared responsibility, maybe had children. And legally, sometimes that will give you either protection or responsibility based on that relationship. It's not necessarily that they use common law to say, this is a law that you disregarded. It's more of like if you're having a court ruling or there's something that needs to be settled, they'll say, okay, well, commonly this is what happens in our society. This is kind of the rules that we follow as a society. Institutional policies and procedures, they don't have the same force as law, right? Like if you break a policy in the hospital that you work at, you're not going to go be arrested or have charges against you, but you might get in trouble, right? If you don't follow policy and procedure. We get our policies procedure, they kind of guide you on what you should do, and they kind of all come from the Nurse Practice Act. I want you guys to know that the policies and procedures don't take precedence over the law. So if you ever see something in a policy and procedure and you're like, wait a second, this does not seem right. This seems kind of confusing because I know that this is like, from the Nurse Practice Act, it doesn't absolve you. You can't just go, oh, this is the policy. You have to say, no, this seems like a conflict, right? That's a conflict. That's an ethical dilemma where you have two things that are coming to you. Get help. Then criminal law, those are laws related to public welfare. So crimes are enforceable or punishable with imprisonment, probation, loss of license, fine. Any violation of law that talks about nursing is a crime. So civil law is another branch. I know there's so many types, right? Civil law is between organizations and individuals. So maybe you might have a lawsuit like a hospital with a nurse or somewhere else. Nurses who break the law sometimes can be in civil lawsuits as well as criminal lawsuits, right? Like I'm sure we've all seen news stories of nurses who have accidentally given the wrong medicine and harmed a patient. They can have a criminal lawsuit for causing harm to a patient, but they can also have a civil lawsuit maybe by the facility for breaking policy or procedures, or by the family that wants to kind of have a civil suit against them. So here's some things that can kind of help guide you, keep you out of trouble. The standard of care, right? So that's a statement or a term that we use of like, what is the standard of care? I think a good example of this is when we talk about how often do you take vital signs on patients? Right? Really, it's a standard of care. If you're looking at somebody that maybe is in the hospital and they're in the ICU and they're very sick, you might be taking them every 5 minutes or more, right? Very frequently, they're very ill. If you're in a long-term care facility and you have somebody that's very stable, there's sometimes patients only have it like vital signs once a month, right? And so those two are very different things, but it's the standard of care. As a nurse, a patient who's very ill, we need to monitor them frequently. Their standard is much higher than somebody who is stable in a long-term care facility. Duty to seek medical care for the patient. I think of this as being an advocate for them, right? Like if you notice your patient is in pain and they are hurting, right? Maybe it's after a surgery and the provider didn't order pain medicine for them. And you've put on ice packs and none of these things, but you're going, gosh, this patient just had a big, maybe abdominal surgery. They're hurting. Your duty is to seek that care for that patient. Or if that patient maybe later, their blood pressure starts dropping, maybe they're bleeding somewhere, right? We don't ignore that and just watch it. We're gonna go seek care for them. We're gonna say, hey, I'm concerned, right? We're gonna cuss out our providers with our, that, what's the cuss stand for? Do you guys remember? What's the C? I'm concerned. So I say I'm concerned. What's the U? Right? That something's making me uncomfortable. And the S is safety. Safety. I think this is a safety issue. Any one of those words is kind of a highlight word that when you say it, it should pique people's ears. They go, ooh. And you guys even use cuss with your other staff too, right? Maybe you go answer a call light and somebody, you're like, does not seem right. It's not your patient, but you can use those terms with your fellow nurses too, or whoever it is. You might say, hey, I am concerned about this patient. There's something going on, right? It's those key words that kind of let us know it's not just, I'm not just pushing this on you. I'm actually, I have a concern. Like, I think this is safety. Okay, moving forward, which nursing action ensures the patient's permission to treat? A little bit confusing because there's long answers here. So let's go over these. So permission to treat, is it this first one, asking the patient to sign an informed consent and document each time you administer meds? The second one is explaining to patients the procedure you're going to do and what to expect. Third, checking admission documents for permission to treat before entering the patient's room. Or the last one, having the patient co-sign physician orders and medication sheets. Yeah, this one was really long. I don't love, this was F.A. Davis, so I take what I get. But you guys are mostly correct. Explain to the patient what you're gonna do and what to expect. So the first one, asking patient to sign an informed consent document each time you administer medications. Is that part of what we've learned with medications? No, right? Like the patients usually, when they're admitted to the hospital or facility or wherever they at, they sign a document that gives you the right to treat them. That covers giving medications, assessing, doing vital signs, all the things that we normally do. Which it kind of mentions here, check in the third answer, checking admission documents for permission to treat before entering the patient's room, right? If somebody is a newly admitted patient, you might make sure that they've signed those admitting documents, but we don't need to do it every time that we've entered the room. And then having the patient co-sign physician orders and medication sheets, right? No, they don't need to do that. They don't have any authority or anything to sway those sheets. All right, moving on. Good Samaritan law. It's developed to protect those who voluntarily give assistance and care in emergency without expecting to be paid. It gives protection to claims of negligence while providing care to the best of their ability, and it must be an emergency situation with the consent of the patient if possible. This was developed because a lot of times medical people, we found that as a society, we're a bit hesitant to provide care to people in emergency situations because they were afraid of getting sued, right? They're afraid of people wanting to come back at them and say, I just broke my arm and you move this. And so and so that's why the kind of the things behind the Good Samaritan law are, you're giving it, it's an emergency situation and we get the consent if possible, and it just protects you as long as you're doing something to the best of your ability, right? I had a situation several years ago now. It's when my son Preston, you guys thought you were out of having him as your like forever case study, but he's back. He was actually in the ICU at Mary Bridge when he was first diagnosed with diabetes. And I had excuse me, I had spent, I think it was 2 full days with him and hadn't slept. And my husband was like, okay, you just need to go home. He's okay right now. And so it was evening. I think it was about 7:45-ish in the evening, which tracks, because I'll tell you. And I was, at Mary Bridge, and I was just driving down, not 19th, whatever the street, Sprague. I think Sprague. So it wasn't very far from here at all. And I remember being so tired and just being like, okay, don't fall asleep. It's kind of, the sun's going down. It's dusky. It's dark. Like, stay awake. And as I'm driving down the street, there's a big white truck in front of me. And all of a sudden, I hear this boom. And right after I hear it, I saw this shoe fly across like beside my car. And I was like, oh, that's not good. And so I pulled over and I realized that there was, and actually I saw somebody kind of, I thought in my head, I thought that must be a dog, right? Like maybe a dog just got hit. My brain wasn't like fully wanting to connect pieces. But it was a man who had crossed the street during really busy traffic time. It was dusk and dark. He was wearing very dark clothing, and the truck in front of me had hit him. And so I got out of my car and ran over, and he was a mess. And so I immediately started like checking for a pulse, and there wasn't one. And shortly after that, like right as I was doing that, another gal showed up, and we said, okay, we got to start CPR. And so we kind of repositioned him a little bit, and I told her to kind of hold his head. It was kind of all messy. And so she kind of, we're not going to do respirations necessarily in that, but we want to open airway. And so I started doing compressions. And it was pretty awful. He was really injured very severely. And in that time, it was really scary for me because, a lot of people had stopped. There's a lot of houses along that street there. And as I'm doing CPR, this man came over, and I found out later, he was a neighbor across the street. And he was a very large man. And he was standing over me, like very close. And he started yelling at me. And he was screaming that I was hurting him, that I was injuring this guy. He was like, I don't know what you're doing. You're trying to like crush his chest and you're hurting him. And he's like, you need to, anyway, he was just very aggressive, very close to me. And I was kind of worried that he was going to do something to me. In my mind, I knew that CPR is a violent thing, right? Has anybody been had to do CPR ever, like chest compressions, right? It's violent, right? Like remember how deep you're supposed to go with adults? Like 2 inches, right? You're supposed to really be pushing hard on that chest. CPR looks pretty awful because the patient's in an awful state, right? And our only chance of trying to recover them is to do that. And so I just remember crying and I wasn't going to stop doing CPR because I knew that if this guy had any chance at all, like I needed to continue. And fortunately, I still remember her. She was teeny tiny. She was a little tiny thing, and she came over and she used a lot of expletives that I'm not going to use. But she was like, you need to back the something up and get away from her because she's doing exactly what she needs to do. This is the only chance to save this man, and you need to get away. And anyway, she stood him down. And I was so very thankful for that. Hey, Juana, come on in. And I was so thankful for that. I learned later the gal that had helped me, like when I was doing CPR, was actually a tech for Tacoma General. It was 7:45, right? Everybody was getting off shift. And then she was a ER physician's assistant from St. Joe's, I believe. And so I just felt so thankful that she came by. And it ended up the guy was not, I think my hope is that he passed away immediately. He had pretty severe injuries. Fortunately, there was an ambulance rig that came by pretty soon after. They were actually a pediatric rig. They were on their way back to Mary Bridge, but they saw what had happened. And so they stopped and almost immediately kind of called that this patient had passed away. But you can imagine, as an educator, as a nurse, I knew that that patient needed CPR, right? If they had any chance of living, they needed that. If somebody maybe didn't have that same knowledge, maybe they've been trained in CPR, but they don't have the same knowledge. If we don't have the Good Samaritan law and that guy came up and was yelling and screaming at them, you can imagine they're like, I don't want to get sued. I don't want to put myself in a position where I'm going to be put in harm, right? So the Good Samaritan law that gave me the freedom of knowing, like, right, because I also think with that kind of accident, C-spine injury, like, what's that going to do? Well, it doesn't matter if he's not breathing, right? If he doesn't have a heart rate, none of that really matters. And so the Good Samaritan law really is there to protect you. I hope none of you are in that situation where you feel fearful like that. But do know that if there is something that happens, we are protected by that. And I love that little teeny tiny PA came up and was an advocate for me as well, right? And so I want to encourage you guys to be an advocate for those around you. If you see somebody who is, being threatened or something's happening, please stand up for them. Like, right, she didn't have a lot of physical sustenance to her, but she knew that she had a colleague that was, in trouble, and she came and helped me, and I'm forever grateful. So anyway, even though it was years ago, I still remember her. So that's my story about the Good Samaritan law. And just, I think our society, especially now, even post-pandemic, we get very sue happy. Like my kids even are like, you should just sue them. And I'm like, for getting my Target order wrong? Like, what are you talking about? Like, I think we have this idea that we can sue anybody. And really, with issues like this, the Good Samaritan law does protect you. And it's just the biggest things are it needs to be an absolute emergency, right? And it needs to be, we can get that patient consent. And that situation I was just telling you about, I couldn't get his consent, right? He wasn't breathing, he can't talk. He didn't have anybody there with him that I could ask for consent for. So you have to go in like patient's best interest, right? He's not breathing, his heart's not beating. I'm going to start CPR on him. Okay. So a couple of other legal issues specific to nursing. Confidentiality, right? What do we always talk about when we talk about confidentiality? HIPAA, right? It's a HIPAA violation. And so that's really, HIPAA is kind of one of those rules that are legal things that we have to abide by. But confidentiality is kind of a practice, that's something that we always make sure that we hold, and that we're not going to share things with people who aren't, don't have privy to that. Permission to treat. So patients have to sign documents, like I talked about earlier, that gives you the permission to treat wherever you're at. Everybody has the right to refuse treatment though, right? Just because somebody signed a document when they're admitted doesn't mean that you now can do whatever you want with them, right? Anybody seen somebody who refused a medication? Right? What about left AMA or against medical advice? Right? Patients can do that. That is their right to receive or not receive treatment. Now, if a patient is continually not wanting to receive treatment, they're refusing everything, I'd encourage you guys to have a conversation with them, or maybe asking the medical team to have a conversation about, hey, what are our goals here? Are your goals as a patient the same as our goals here? Because if they're not, then maybe you need to go home. Maybe you do need to leave if this is inappropriate for you. All right, so here's a question for you. A nurse writes in a chart note that the physician is, quote, unreasonable and refuses to prescribe morphine for a patient in pain. What is this an example of? Informed consent, libel, slander, or negligence? All right, well, we have some opportunities to learn. So it is called libel. So the things that I think people get confused of are libel and slander. That's when you're speaking poorly of somebody else, especially it's like a professional thing. Um, So it's defamation of character. If you share information with somebody else that's malicious or false. So going back to the statement, the nurse writes, the physician is unreasonable and refuses to prescribe morphine for the patient in pain. That might be true, but that's not what you would document, because saying that they're unreasonable, is that very clear when you're reading somebody's chart? If somebody says they're unreasonable, not really. Do you guys remember when we went to Western State and we talked about documenting a patient who was like kind of out of control? Wait, did you guys do that with me? That was the other cohort. Anyway, it's important we're very specific with our documentation, right? What would be a way that maybe same situation, right? You've called the doc, they're not being reasonable, right? You're asking them, the patient's clearly in pain, they're refusing to prescribe something. What is a way that you could appropriately chart this? Write exactly what you say, right? You could quote, like, what did the doctor say? You could use that. You might say, like use your S bar, right? You could even document that, or I think it's next week. We're going to talk more about some documentation, practicing some of our documentation. But you just want to be very clear and just state what happened, patient's in pain, notified the provider, provider does not wish to order anything new, patient now states pain at such and such, maybe note some of the characteristics that the patient's describing, notified provider again, still refuses something, or they don't wish to prescribe anything. You just want to be very objective, very clear, right? So when you write that they are unreasonable, and refuses patient to give patient pain medicine, it just seems like it's not very objective, right? It's definitely giving a lean on what you think the provider is doing or kind of their character. So libel, I think libel literature and slander is what you say. So libel is when you write that out. So because charting is a type of literature or written word, that's libel, that's what we just saw is in the chart. Libel is that type of defamation. Slander is when you say something. So if I was going around saying, man, this doc's a jerk, he never wants to provide medicine for people, he's so unreasonable, that would be a type of slander because I'm saying it out loud. Advanced directives. I know we've talked so much about them throughout the program, but I just want to remind you guys, this is a legal thing as well. We want to make sure that patients know, at least patients have the opportunity to let us know what they want at the end of life. We want patients, hopefully, to be able to make decisions on their own before the end of their life comes, right? Really, really beneficial. Or if patients, like maybe they're not able to write their own advanced directive, we want to talk to loved ones. Okay, your husband, wife is gravely ill. What do you want us to do for them if they would start to become more ill? It's really good to have those conversations so that we can respect what the patient or the family wishes before that time comes. Also, durable power of attorney. Sometimes you'll see this kind of shortened into DPOA, durable power of attorney. That's somebody that has been authorized legally to make medical decisions for the patient. So let's say that I make my husband my DPOA, right? He's my durable power of attorney. We go in to have surgery. Like I'm just right now, just me, I stubbed my toe and now have to amputate. Can my husband sign the consent for me because he's my DPOA? Right? No. DPOA for somebody who is legally competent, who can talk, answer questions, that's just, he's my power of attorney if something were to happen, right? If I got in a car wreck and I was gravely injured and I needed surgery and couldn't give that consent on my own, then my husband, yeah, he's my durable power of attorney. He can do that. But we would only do that if I wasn't able to answer. Now, what about if I hadn't given him my durable power of attorney? He was just my husband. Could he still sign consent? I know, tricky. Yeah. So typically what you do with somebody, if they cannot give you your own consent, you try to find family. Like the situation I talked about earlier with the man that was hit by the truck. I looked around to see if there's anybody around him that knew him before I started CPR, right? Because I'm like, hey, your loved one, I want to help him, and usually they're like, yes, help them, And so if you have an emergency, you always have patient first, then family. Family members, you typically go spouse. If they're married, you go to their spouse. They're the ones who make decisions for them. If they don't have a spouse, then kind of depending on the age, you might reach out to their parents, or if they're older, you reach out to their children. If you can't get a hold of any family members and maybe somebody does need an emergency procedure or surgery, do you guys know what happens? Yeah. So the healthcare team decides if they're going to do surgery, maybe on the patient, you have to have or actually any procedure, anything that they're just determining needs to be done, you know, like a course of treatment or something, there needs to be two providers. So maybe if it's a surgery that needs to be done, the surgeon is gonna say, yes, I believe this needs to be done because of X, Y, Z. And another independent provider, not like their assistant or something, you know, maybe the ER provider or the inpatient provider, somebody else is also gonna come along and say, yes, I also agree, this is medically necessary, we're gonna do that. So you wanna have two independent people, and they're the ones that sign the consent form. And guess what? You as nurses still witness it. And you need to make sure that both providers are, you know, you need to make sure that it's not that they just both signed it. It's you need to make sure, nope, they're both on, they both written a note, they both have said that they fully agree that this is what's necessary. Because you, as a nurse, right, your responsibility is to make sure the people who signed and witnessed that consent are aware, right, and have an understanding of what's going on. Okay, I think we're almost done and we'll take a break. Hang in with me. All right, so what is the purpose of advanced directives? Okay, guys, this is a select all that apply. I'm going to read these because they're a little bit tiny. To give guidance to the person who has a durable power of attorney, to give caregivers authority to allow a patient to die with dignity, to allow an individual to instruct caregivers before surgery what he wishes about life-ending decisions or end-of-life decisions, to provide guidance to administrators for staffing needs, or to protect nurses from litigation. Does it let you select all? Ah, rats. Okay, I'll write that down to fix it. Okay, well, choose your best answer. All right, let's see. All right, so pretty much, yay, good job, you guys. So yes, to give guidance to the person who has durable power of attorney. Advanced directives are really important. Like if my husband gives me power of attorney for his health care, I want to know like his advanced directives, like what he wishes, right? And hopefully we've had a conversation, but if it's legal, if it's legally down, like there's an advanced directive form that's filled out, that supports that too. It's really interesting. We've been talking to my in-laws about advanced directives. They're kind of aging. My father-in-law is 10 years older than my mother-in-law. And so he's, you know, declining a bit faster than she is. And it was really interesting because my mom-in-law was like, yeah, I think I'm going to go to the safe deposit box and get our advanced directive form. And just so, you know, you guys can have a copy. And me being the nurse, I was just like, oh, thank you. And I was like, could we maybe have a conversation about it too? And she was like, oh, I mean, do you think we need to? I was like going, oh gosh. And I was like, I'm like, unfortunately with my mom passing away, I feel like I have a little bit more agency or, you know, like anybody just going through a situation like that, I think would have a little more. And I was like, you know, I'm like, I think it would be really nice to have a conversation because, for instance, if you say, you know, I don't want heroic life sustaining measures, that might be different to every person in the room. And my mom-in-law was like, really? And I was like, oh, like she really has no idea. I was like, yeah, it could be very tricky because what one person thinks is very different. And my husband's family is very, they're not super open with each other. That's just kind of their way of doing, they do things very side by side, but not necessarily connecting or like sharing. And so anyway, it's not comical, but it's kind of funny as I'm watching this unfold with all the siblings and them trying to like get together, and it's just interesting. So anyway, so important that if you have advanced directives, talk to people about it, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So like, what do they do? Like, okay, somebody passes and, let's say like with my kids' oldest dad.
Yeah.
Passed, and he didn't have anything in place at all.
Yeah.
But they, instead of like the medical examiner coming out and taking him, instead his girlfriend said, I'm his spouse, which she wasn't, and then sent him to like a funeral home. So how come that doesn't get verified like it does in the hospital? Why
So
are
that
they
was that was at home.
Yeah, because he passed
At
at home. And
I think that's more of because it's the where you're at, right? You're at home and somebody, once they've already passed, I don't know the rules on that, especially at home. I know in the hospital or in acute care or in the medical, area, they really try to confirm that, but if there's an emergency situation and somebody shows up and says, I'm the wife, and yes, to give them surgery, they need it right now. We're not gonna say, well, can you show us your marriage license?
Yeah.
It's kind of, it is a little bit tricky. And part of that, I think almost goes back to the Good Samaritan law, where it's like, hey, if you're trying to look in the best interest of your patient, right? You're not trying to do something harmful to them. And if you're like, you can't make a decision, but you're saying you're the spouse, maybe you got pictures of you guys on your phone,
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, well, this patient needs this, so I'll then help them make decisions until we know differently. But yeah, it is really tricky, especially when you get into situations where there's blended families, where, that's why I was talking about common law marriage and more, because sometimes like we allow people different rights. If you're like, well, you're not technically the wife, but been together for 20 years, you're pretty much married,
Or you get into those places where like you have conflicting family members saying, no, I don't want this, but yes, and especially if they don't have an advance.
And that happens a lot. And so, and that's where I think, like by encouraging my family to talk about my father-in-law's advance directive, because he might feel like, oh, this is super clear. This says this. But I would guarantee if all of the siblings read his advance directive, they'd probably all take something different away from it. And so if that would still happen though in the hospital, typically what happens is there's a usually social worker, the provider would call a meeting with the family and just say, hey, we get that there's some conflicts. Maybe not everybody's clear. We'd love to, and usually the way they frame it is what's best for this patient, right? Let's talk about what is best for mom or dad or whoever we're talking about. And then they try to have a meeting where everybody can come together. Usually when the medical staff is kind of leading that, there's usually better outcomes than if it's, just the family trying, because there's so many emotions that go on, with end of life issues. And so, unfortunately, I've seen it happen many times, that sometimes the medical staff, we do have to step in. And as nurses, you're probably part of that team. I'd encourage you not to be the ones that necessarily lead that type of meeting. Usually it's the provider. So whatever doctor, nurse practitioner, whoever's kind of providing like the main care provider kind of leads that meeting. And then you're there as a support personnel that helps encourage the family, answer questions, things like that. All right, you guys are dying. Let's go ahead and take a break. Thanks for hanging with me. We'll finish this when we get back and then we'll go into some of our group discussions. So let's see, how about come back at 9:40? That gives you a nice good break to get some coffee and then come back strong. All right, I'll see you then. Go for it. All right, we are almost done with the presentation and we'll get to doing some group work soon. So talking about continuing talking about some of the issues that relate to nursing, negligence. That's one of the words that we use that you can be charged with, or like we kind of try to stay away from. So really negligence is making sure that you're meeting that standard of care. We talk about what standard of care is. So as long as you're meeting it, there's not negligence happening. It's when you fail to perform the standard of care. If you're going to actually be charged with it, or if they want to like get you in trouble, they being whoever, they have to establish certain things first to prove this. And they have to say that, first of all, there was a standard of care that existed with that patient, right? And most cases there are, but we want to make sure like we know what is that standard of care. Then we have to establish that there was a breach, right? As a nurse, we didn't do what we were supposed to do. There was a breach. And because of that breach, there was damage or injury that occurred. And there has to also be proof that not only were there damages that occurred, but it was a consequence of the breach. It wasn't just that you didn't do something and this happened. It's that no, because we didn't do something, this happened. So there are a few safeguards that you can't just be charged with negligence willy-nilly or like anything, but just know that as long as you're meeting the standard of care, you don't have to worry about that. And if you're concerned, if you're like, wait, I'm not sure what the standard of care is, what do you guys do? Ask somebody, right? Don't be nervous alone. Go find a buddy, find a friend, find your mentor, somebody that can help you. well, let me click back in. Okay, malpractice. This is when so that would be us as nurses, we can be charged with malpractice because it's negligence performed by a person with a license, right? We have a license to practice. When you guys graduate, you're gonna be licensed practical nurses, right? Fraud, that's a term that references doing something for purpose of gain. A lot of times we talk about medical fraud, especially when we're talking about nursing and the law. So sometimes this is about coding even, right? If you have a patient that comes in maybe in a clinic and they're here, actually it's been a lot, I think in the news and other things where you have a patient who is there for a certain appointment and they're like, but can you also do this while you're here? Right. And so, like, I don't know if you guys have seen it in my primary care office, they have said, hey, if you bring up something that's not what you're here for, we might have to have additional billing for you. Because they're saying, hey, we're billing you for this type of appointment, but if something else happens and you want this type of treatment as well, we might have to also bill you for that. That's not a problem. It's more of when never you guys, never, right. We're gonna put this on some evil miser person who was like, I'm gonna put in some billing for this or this. I know if this happens, I get more pay from this, or my department gets more revenue, or something happens. And even though the patient doesn't really need this, I'm gonna really push for this because I know it's gonna have some personal gain for this. So that would be like medical fraud. Then we talk about assault. I think it's so funny because assault, we always think about like somebody beating you up, but assault is the threat of something happening. It's not actually the actual incidence of it. So it's the threat of unlawfully touching somebody else. In nursing, we talk about this more of like talking about battery when we have the unlawful touching of somebody without consent, justification, or excuse. So in nursing, when do you think that somebody, maybe a patient, could claim that you had battery against them or you battered them?
Doing something that want medication.
Maybe giving them medicine you didn't want to. Maybe an assessment. I think about restraints. Right? Like if grandma's sundowning and she's trying to get out of bed and she punched somebody. So we're like, oh, okay, we need to restrain her for right now, figure this out. Family comes in and they're like, you just touched her and held her down and you were doing these things that she didn't want to. They could accuse you of, it would be assault because you threatened to do it because you said you were going to do it, but also battery because you did do it. Now that will not hold up in a court anywhere, right? Because grandma already punched staff and needed to be, she needed to be restrained. It was medically necessary for her safety. But that's where kind of that comes into process with, which is why I want to encourage you guys, if you ever have to restrain somebody, don't go alone, right? First of all, it's probably not safe, right? If you have to restrain somebody, it's for a purpose. And second, you want to have an extra pair of eyes because it is kind of a tricky situation, right? So just have a second person there with you. The next thing that we kind of talk about, it's kind of similar, is false imprisonment, right? Making somebody stay somewhere they don't want to, right? And this gets kind of tricky, like when we're restraining people, and maybe grandma wakes up in the morning and she's clear-headed, right? She doesn't need to be restrained. I think about these patients who come in to the emergency room and they're suicidal and they've been deemed a safety risk to themselves. And so that gets kind of tricky when they're like, no, I want to leave now. But you, as the nurse, are going, wait a second, we've done the suicide screening. You are a high risk of hurting yourself. I'm concerned with letting you leave. And so that's where people are like, okay, am I falsely imprisoning? What am I doing? But I also don't want to let them get hurt. Well, don't be nervous alone. Go get help. You're going to be talking to your social worker, your charge nurse, and they're actually going to have to do an evaluation on these people before they're allowed to go to make sure they're not going to just leave and hurt themselves, right? And so that's why it's physical or non-physical means too. Meaning, are we putting up a barrier to keep them from leaving somewhere? Are we physically restraining them with a restraint? Are we giving medication to them that would make them be sleepy and not want to go somewhere? That could be considered a chemical restraint, right? So the patient does have a right to leave any facility at any time, even against medical advice. as long as they've been deemed competent, right? We want to make sure that they are safe and competent, have been cleared, especially there's mental health issues, that they have been cleared from the psychology standpoint, just to make sure that they're not going to go hurt themselves. So a couple things for safeguards, and these were in, I believe, the reading that you guys had for the law discussion board. So knowledge, like how do you prevent a lawsuit? Basically just doing the right thing, right? So know what the patient's needs and wants, right? Know your patients, know what your policies are, and know what your standards of care is, right? If you can be aware of those things, that's going to really help you. And record, right? If grandma punches somebody in the face, she starts cursing at you and you're like, hey, we need to restrain grandma. Like she's a danger to other people. She keeps getting up and trying to fall. She's trying to like pull her IV out. There's all these things happening. You're going to record that, meaning you're going to document it, right? And we're not going to say grandma is aggressive and cursing and seems crazy, right? We're going to document grandma seems agitated. She is doing XYZ. She is raising her voice so that I can hear it in the hallway saying these words, quoting whatever she says. You know, grandma is seen to be pulling at her IV saying whatever she's saying. You know, we're going to be very objective and just put the facts on there. And then we also report that too, right? If we see these escalating things happen, we're going to document it. We're also going to go to our charge nurse or whoever else and go, listen, I think we're going to need to do, you know, restrain her, put her in a posy, put a wrap on her arm, something. And that's going to help ensure that you're doing the right thing because you have somebody with higher authority kind of helping guide you through those policies and procedures and what's right. And then one thing I love that so many of you guys put this on the discussion board, question, right? A questioning attitude is such a good thing in healthcare and it doesn't stop like after your first year or two of nursing, right? It's hopefully going to continue on. Anytime that I'm working with patients, I'm always like, okay, well, why are we doing that? Okay, what about this? What about this? Like, it's kind of like it's all a big science experiment, which sounds kind of cruel and weird when we're talking about people, but that's what medicine is. That's what healthcare is. It's a science experiment. We're saying, okay, what works for this? Does it work? Does it not work? Okay, why are we doing this? What effect does that have? I want you guys all to have inquiring minds because it will help benefit your patients in the long run. All right, end of discussion. Really quick, what stuck out to you the most today about what we learned? You can type in here, we can talk about it. What do you feel like is sticking out? Yeah. Ethical. Mm-hmm. Yeah, watching out for the patients. Oh my gosh, we're almost at the very end of our class time. I was thinking we had a whole nother hour, you guys. Oh my gosh, I'm so used to like med surge being all day. Okay, changing plans. We're not going to do our little thing we were going to do. Oh, man, I had so much fun. We're not going to get to Jeopardy. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the group project that's coming up, right? We only have two more sessions in class together? I think that's it because after that, let's go back to our modules because that's how I navigate everything. We're in week 4. Next week, you guys are going to work on your quality improvement project in class. We're going to do a little bit of work, but I'm going to give you class time to work on your quality improvement project. Then the next week, you're going to present your quality improvement projects in class. And then week 7, you have your comprehensive test B. So again, it'll be over in the class in the computer rooms. It's a long test. So know if you're a slower test taker, you might have to stay till after 10 o'clock. So just be aware. I'm actually going to be out of town that day, but Eileen is going to be proctoring you guys on that day for the comprehensive B. Then on 8/12, the next week, that's going to be the mock interview panels. Guys, I'm so excited. I've been getting responses from the people, I volunteers come do this. So I have people who I know that are nurses or leaders in the community or work at other facilities. So they, along with other Bates personnel, come and they're part of your interview panels. It's a great way of just practicing, right? It's kind of anytime you interview is nerve-wracking, but this is a great way of practicing. So that's 8/12. And then the next week, right? That's the last week. 18th, 19th, and 20th are the live review sessions, with the 18th being your pinning ceremony. I'm so excited for that. And then the 21st is the predictor. So, man, 2 more sessions with you guys. Oh, like growing pains. Fahim? Oh, great question. So not the following day, the following week. So where's my calendar? I don't think I have it on here. Typically we do it like the next week. So it'd be like the next Friday, we would do another predictor for you. Yes, yeah.
I thought Thursday was-
Oh, it is Thursday.
Yeah.
Do you guys have a preference of when you come back the next week to take the predictor?
Oh, we take it again twice?
You can. I can't make you, but I think it's a good idea. So you take the first one and it tells you how you do, your probability of passing, and then gives you like a remediation, like a plan for like how to study. There's a second different test, another predictor you could take again to help you prepare for the NCLEX.
And how long before they schedule out the NCLEX from?
Usually it takes a couple weeks before, because it has to be after grades have entered and their transcripts have been released. But all the things that you guys are doing now with reviewing your transcripts, sending out your credential, or not credentialing yet, but all of those things are gonna help smooth that pathway.
Oh, are we not supposed to send out the credentialing form?
Did I already put it out as the assignment? Yeah, I think you can do it. I think it's just making sure that all the pieces before that are done too. Yeah. Lisa, did you have a question?
How long is it?
Same as,
150?
I think it might be 180. It's long. Yeah, it's a very long test. And I know some students are like, it's so long. Your NCLEX might be that long, right? It might be really short, but it might be really long as well. And so I think it's really good practice for taking that predictor. So you're right, the first predictor is Thursday. There'll be a second different predictor the next week. I need to schedule it. I won't be here. I'm on, like, we have summer break for faculty, but Jen, our sim tech, is here and can proctor you guys. What day of the week do you guys prefer to take the second predictor test? Tuesday? Okay, yeah, there's kind of a quick turnaround with that. But what I'll encourage you guys is that if you can't take it that Tuesday, reach out to Bryant, because he can contact Jen as far as if you can schedule another time. Because it's such a long test, we try just to have maybe 1 or 2 times that students take that second predictor test. Just because it's a long time for Jen or whoever's here to be sitting proctoring tests.
Maybe I missed it. How do we see our partners group?
The group project, I haven't made them yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was gonna do that on break while you guys were doing your group things, and I was thinking we had an extra hour. So let me go over the group project really quick with you guys, because I want to make sure you guys know, and then I'll make the projects right after class. Or I'll make the groups right after class. So